Happy Wealth Wednesday. Julia, so good to connect with you. I'm excited to share your story. You have a remarkably interesting background from marketing all the way to now emerging technologies and really driving trading of cryptocurrencies and what that looks like. So I'm excited to dive in. I'd love if you could kick us off with just a little bit about what you're up to these days and where you're based right now.
Sure. So I'm based in Singapore. I've lived here for almost a decade, and I am currently heading up venture and market making services at AlphaLab Capital.
Awesome. I can't wait to dive into Alpha Labs. Before we do that, we ask everyone the same question. It's really equalizing and it kind of brings back, even if we're all kind of professional investors now, where we got started. So, what was your first ever investment? Do you remember like what got you into public markets, private markets, or even cryptocurrency?
That's a great question. I think my first ever investment was shares of Starbucks that I got for being a barista there. So I got a job at Starbucks when I think I was like 16 or 17 years old. I was in high school. And back then they had this like employee share option. And so that was my very first introduction to like what is a share of a company.
Wow, I love that story. And what a cool way to, get something of value that you didn't even really know was valuable maybe until now. And so with Alpha Lab, can you tell me how did you get into this space? Because you've had a really interesting career from clean tech to marketing and gaming. How did you end up in Alpha Labs and what does that look like for you today?
So my career has been very much what Clayton Christensen in his writing calls emergent strategies, right? Like basically, I've always looked for where things are exciting and where I see a lot of growth. And I just kind of, gravitate towards people who I think are doing exciting things. So when I graduated from university, it was 2007, which was the first year that it was like the iPhone was launched and Facebook was launched. So tech, um, web and mobile technologies was really taking off in a huge way. And so that's kind of the sector that I went into. And I worked in early stage tech startups. I worked for three of them between seed and Series B. So the company sizes at that point were somewhere between like 5 to 200 people. And a lot of my, early career was about growing those companies, growing the teams, growing the revenue of those companies, just very like hands-on operational role. And then in 2018, that's when AlphaLab was founded. So AlphaLab is a quantitative trading firm that's crypto native. And it was founded by two very close friends of mine who have a background in tech product and the financial markets. So I got involved in the beginning, just, doing all kinds of different things to grow the business from the operational side to recruiting to business development. And eventually, as the company grew and more opportunities emerged in the space, I ended up in the role that I am now. So it was not intentional, my career path. I did not set out with some grand plan 15 years ago to be where I am today. It was very organic, very much about following, where there are market opportunities, where I can add value with my skills, and just, here I am.
A big part of that is saying yes to those opportunities when they show up. For the
Yes.
people who are here and maybe aren't as familiar with what a quant trading firm is or quantitative trading firm, can you just describe that for people listening?
Of course. So AlphaLab Capital is primarily a market maker. And what a market maker does is we make it possible for people to buy and sell things more easily. So the best analogy that I always use to explain to people what market making is and what AlphaLab Capital is that of the money changers at airports. So if you're flying from the US to London, right, you go to this little kiosk at the airport, you give them your dollars and they give you some pounds. And for the traveler who's flying in from London, they do the reverse, right? So now imagine what that experience would be like without that little kiosk there. You would have to run around the airport trying to find somebody who had just arrived from the country that you were going to, and you would have to swap, your dollars for their pounds. But they might not want to change the amount that you want to change. The two of you might not agree on an exchange rate. It might take you a long time to like find the right person, right? It would just be a lot more friction to doing that exchange. And the presence of the money changer in the kiosk, he just makes it much easier for everybody, right? So that is kind of what AlphaLab Capital does in the markets. We stand ready to buy and sell, and we make it possible for the markets to be more liquid. And just like the money changer at the airports, we earn a small spread for doing that service.
Fantastic. So no quantitative trading, though, sounds like just market making. Is that right?
That it is quantitative trading. So market making is a subset of quantitative trading. So quantitative trading refers to trading that's done with algorithms, right? So we don't have any people making trading decisions. Nobody's sitting there sort of clicking buy and sell buttons. It's all done with computer algorithms. And that's what quantitative trading refers to. And there's a variety of different types of strategies that sit under the umbrella of quantitative trading. Market making is one of those.
What a brilliant and simple explanation. I love the airport analogy and just how it's tech enabled, right? So
Yes.
thank you so much for sharing that. Being part of this now, what role do you feel you play in the wealth space and why is it important?
Currently, right, in my role as venture, we do two things. So we're an asset manager, right? So we deploy capital and we earn a return on it. And then we're also a conduit of funding for startups. So we are enabling founders to kind of get their ideas off the ground, to scale their businesses, and to grow their projects.
Love that. I saw that on your LinkedIn too, that you're looking actively for new finance and technologies. And I imagine that's with founders. When you're
That I think the best way to think about it is that, for venture capital, we're really a conduit between people who have capital and people who have ideas. And this is something that's actually, really ancient, which I think is super interesting. If you go back to the 1500s, 1400s, right, you had these sort of royalty and nobles, and they would fund these expeditions. Like that's how the sailors who went all around the world and started really like the global shipping and trading industry. That's how they were all funded. And it's very, very similar the way that those deals were done to the way that venture capital is done.
I love that history. And it's really interesting how the first stock market was actually on the basis of the shipping financing and the original stocks and trades were based off of that, which is super cool. What do you
Yes,
think
exactly.
is the most exciting thing that you've learned in this process of even like funding new companies, especially within the blockchain and finance space?
Oh my goodness, there are so many exciting things. I think there are so many exciting new ideas happening all the time. Um, it's really hard to pick one. I think that the concept of decentralized finance as a whole is super, super interesting to me. I mean, there are certain things that, we all kind of take for granted, right? And then sometimes there's a paradigm shift. And then you look backwards and you think, oh, wow, how did we ever sort of all live that way, right? But it seems very normal when you're doing it. So I think that, we currently live in a world that is dominated by fiat currency and these very sort of traditional old rails for moving money around, right? So the plumbing, if you will, of the global financial system, like SWIFT, the ACH system, the system by which we move money around and what we consider to be money, right? It's very old and it hasn't changed in a very, very long time. And so now we're looking at a future where, what is considered an asset what is considered a store of value, and who decides that is something that, what we're potentially looking at is no longer going to be determined solely by governments around the world, but it will be determined by millions, billions of individual people coming together to make those decisions and to validate really like what is an asset in a decentralized way. I think that that is super interesting.
Me too. So when you think about this crazy ecosystem, especially in this decentralized finance world, is there a person or a company or like even a use case that's really inspiring you right now, and why?
Oh goodness. It is very hard to pick one. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. I cannot just pick one off the top of my head.
Okay, well, we'll definitely link them in the chat and the transcript so we can share some ideas of things that you think that have been standout. And even beyond DeFi, like, is there a person that you really look to or a company that like gives you inspiration as you're learning and exploring the space and the ecosystem? Where do you get your information?
Okay. So I think one thing that's very interesting that's happened in the past, let's say 10, 15 years, is that venture capitalists have basically become publishing houses. Like venture capitalists, it is now sort of de rigueur to be publishing content and putting out your thoughts and your takes on the industry and where you see market opportunity, what your theses are, whether that's on social media or blogging. So there's a lot of great other VCs, whether they're crypto native or in Web 2. I think Fred Wilson was really one of like the pioneers of this. And then it's been taken up by many, many other like VCs who are super fantastic. So there's a lot of Substacks that I subscribe to where I get information. Twitter is huge source of information. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, Chris Dixon, A16Z, pretty much made up his whole career and platform off of his publishing, really. So that's a really great insight. Is there any advice that you would give to somebody getting started to be like informed in whether it's their career, their personal investing, or their, professional investing? Where would you go?
So I think in terms of investing, one of the things that I've discovered to be very powerful for me is understanding some key principles, because there can be so much noise, and it's very, as you sort of alluded to, it's very difficult to disentangle sometimes what is real and what is not. But I think there are certain principles that always hold true, right? So for example, one of these principles is that scarcity of opportunities and size of your capital deployment and returns are very intricately linked, right? So where you get outsized returns is where there's some kind of market opportunity that is that has a moat around it, right? If so, like for example, in public equities, which is a market with basically no moat, it's very, very difficult to get returns that beat the market. The vast majority of professional asset managers, hedge fund managers, active fund managers, they do not manage to do that, right? I think private equity is historically, if you look at the returns from private equity, it is substantially higher than those from public equity. And then venture capital is historically the highest performing asset class within private equity. And the reason for that is that as you move into private equity and as you move to VC, the amount of information asymmetry increases, right? So the people who have access to the information, people who have access to the deals, it becomes a smaller and smaller pool. And so because of that, they're able to generate those outsized returns. Now, I think that one thing that's really interesting that's happening right now is that that's changing because information is flowing faster. And with cryptocurrencies, those early stage projects are being made available to a much larger audience than they ever were before. I think those sorts of dynamics, or those, how do you, what I think of them as almost sort of like laws of physics of investing, they're changing. right? So I think that's super interesting. So one dynamic to be aware of there is that until cryptocurrencies were invented, in order to invest in early stage projects, early stage companies, you had to do it via private equity, right? And private equity traditionally had very high barriers to entry. So the average person just couldn't do it, right? You could only invest in companies once they've IPO'd or on the stock market. And generally, a company has to have at least $100 million of revenue to IPO. So by then, it's already a very mature company. Now, with crypto, you have companies that are sometimes pre-revenue, sometimes even pre-product, and they've launched a token, and now those tokens are available on the open market for anybody to buy and sell. And so it's a double-edged sword. It's really very much a double-edged sword. On the one hand, right, you have access to these early stage deals that you wouldn't have before as an average citizen. The flip side is the average person, no matter how well educated they are, the average person who's not doing this as a full-time job does not have enough time to be doing the level of research, analysis, and due diligence that's required. That is coming around to another principle of investing, is that it's really a lot less about intelligence and a lot more about, I think, discipline and just putting in the work, like going through the volume of deals, going through, the due diligence. I think that is really like what makes the difference between a successful and a not successful investor.
I love what you brought up there about the role of blockchain and cryptocurrencies really being this sort of new version of venture capital. On the one hand, publicly available, it feels like stocks, but on the other, still an enormous amount of information, asymmetry. Even though there are public records, right? The blockchain is publicly viewable. The tools to analyze those, and the time it takes to really learn and understand how to vet those projects is still really difficult. And so it can be a publicly available asset and yet still have some of those attributes of venture capital that take real research and diligence to be able to be a strong investor. And I love that you've highlighted that. It's a great
Yeah, just to understand blockchain data, right? Like we've looked at so many pitches for projects that are about analyzing blockchain data and making some kind of sense of it, because it's hard to do. Non-trivial problem. And to this to this point of information asymmetry, I'll just give you an anecdote. I have a close friend who a few months ago recommended to me a project that she'd heard of, and it was not in my space that I typically look at, right, which is Web3, crypto, DeFi. It was like in an entirely different, it was like a Web2 company in an entirely different industry. And she was saying like, oh, this is a really, interesting opportunity. I think it has a lot of market potential. And I looked at the deck and it did seem really interesting. But I said to her, I'm not going to get involved with this, because for me to feel like I've done enough research and due diligence and looked at the competitive landscape and understood the dynamics of this space, I would have to put like days worth of work into this to reach that level of confidence, right? And I frankly don't have the time because I have to focus on, what I'm doing. So I think it's really important as an investor to sort of understand what your edge is and to really hone that edge. I think it can be very easy to, fall into hubris, right? And it's very easy to delude yourself into thinking that you have an edge where you don't.
Absolutely. Thank you for everything that you've shared. How can we stay in touch with you personally on your journey, but also Alpha Labs? If you're a founder or an investor, how can they stay in touch?
Sure. So we're on Twitter. We can put the Twitter channel in the chat and the transcript. We have a website. We have an active blog, but I think probably the best way to follow and to connect with us would be on Twitter.
Fantastic. Well, Julia, thank you so much. I can't wait to watch what you do, what you guys invest in, and as you evolve your edge in this incredibly exciting emergent space. Thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.